The sudden German occupation of Vichy, France in November 1942, known as Case Anton, marked a definitive shift in the balance of power in Western Europe during the Second World War. It brought an abrupt end to the so-called armistice regime that had existed since France's defeat in 1940 and effectively extinguished any remaining semblance of French sovereignty on the European mainland. To understand the causes and consequences of this swift operation, it is necessary to examine the broader geopolitical landscape in which it unfolded, one shaped by military setbacks, shifting alliances, and escalating fears of betrayal within the Axis hierarchy. Following the armistice of June 1940, France had been divided into two zones: the occupied zone in the north, administered directly by the German military, and the so-called free zone in the south, governed from the spa town of Vichy by Marshal Philippe Pétain's collaborationist regime. Although ostensibly independent, the Vichy government operated under heavy constraints, its authority subject to German approval, and its policies increasingly aligned with Axis interests. The free zone served as a buffer region, allowing Germany to maintain a degree of indirect control over southern France without dedicating significant military resources. From the outset, the arrangement was fragile. German officials distrusted Vichy leaders, suspecting that elements within the French military remained loyal to the Allies or might one day defect. Meanwhile, Pétain and his ministers navigated a precarious political line, cooperating with German demands to preserve autonomy while quietly resisting total subjugation. This uneasy equilibrium persisted for over 2 years, held in place less by genuine cooperation than by Germany's need to concentrate its forces elsewhere, particularly on the Eastern Front. By mid-1942, however, the context had changed dramatically. The German war effort had encountered serious challenges. The advance into the Soviet Union had stalled before the gates of Stalingrad, and in North Africa, the British Eighth Army under General Bernard Montgomery had begun pushing Axis forces westward. For Berlin, the Mediterranean theater was becoming a growing concern, particularly as the Allies demonstrated increasing mobility and capacity for amphibious operations. The critical turning point came on November 8, 1942, with the launch of Operation Torch. Anglo-American forces landed in French North Africa, targeting Morocco and Algeria, territories still nominally under Vichy control. The landings represented a direct violation of the armistice terms, as the Allies sought to neutralize Axis influence in the region and open a new front against Germany and Italy. German and Italian planners, recognizing the strategic implications, interpreted the landings as a signal that the Vichy regime could no longer be trusted to defend Axis interests. Hitler's response was immediate. On November 10th, just 2 days after the Torch landings began, he ordered the execution of Case Anton, the pre-planned German operation to seize control of the entirety of France. Though originally drafted in December 1940 as contingency planning, the operation had been periodically updated in anticipation of precisely such an eventuality. It called for German and Italian forces to advance simultaneously into the unoccupied southern zone, neutralize any resistance, and secure key strategic objectives, including ports, railways, and the French fleet at Toulon. The Italian component of the operation, codenamed Operation Gisella, was to proceed in tandem, with Italian forces entering southeastern France from across the Alps. The occupation would not only eliminate the free zone as a political and military factor, but would also serve to prevent Allied forces from establishing a foothold in southern France should they decide to expand their Mediterranean operations. For the German High Command, swift action was essential. The primary concern was the possibility that the Vichy government might allow Allied forces to land in southern France or transfer remaining military assets, particularly the fleet, to British or American control. Case Anton was also driven by a deepening ideological mistrust. Despite Vichy's official policy of neutrality and cooperation, German leaders, especially within the SS and Foreign Ministry, suspected duplicity. Internal intelligence assessments pointed to growing dissent within Vichy circles, contact between French officials and Allied representatives, and wavering loyalty within the French military. With the balance of the war shifting and Italy growing more vulnerable, Germany could no longer tolerate even the appearance of French independence. The suddenness of the operation also reflected broader German anxieties about maintaining control over occupied Europe. By late 1942, resistance movements were growing across the continent, from Norway to Yugoslavia. The German administration feared that any perceived weakening of Axis control, especially in a state as symbolically and geopolitically important as France, could trigger uprisings or defections. The seizure of Vichy territory was meant to send a message. The Reich remained firmly in control. For the Vichy regime, the impending crisis was sensed but not fully anticipated. Pétain and Prime Minister Pierre Laval were aware of German suspicions, but believed, or at least hoped, that their policy of collaboration would shield them from direct occupation. They had received no credible intelligence of an imminent German military action, and when the Wehrmacht began crossing the demarcation line on the morning of November 11th, the Vichy government was taken by surprise. Communications between Paris, Vichy, and provincial prefects were quickly disrupted. Local authorities received conflicting instructions. Some French units initially mobilized, but were quickly ordered to stand down. By the end of that day, the armistice regime had effectively ceased to function as an independent political entity. German forces encountered minimal resistance as they advanced through key towns and cities in southern France. Within 48 hours, the entire free zone had been occupied. Italian troops, though slower to deploy, took control of the Côte d'Azur, including Nice and Menton. The operation, completed without significant combat, nevertheless represented a profound shift in the wartime structure of France and marked the beginning of the final phase of German domination over metropolitan French territory. On the morning of November 11, 1942, German forces initiated the full implementation of Case Anton, crossing the demarcation line that had separated the occupied zone from the so-called free zone in Vichy France. The operation was executed with a precision reflective of months of contingency planning, yet it retained the character of a rapid occupation rather than a military campaign. There was no formal declaration of hostilities. Instead, German motorized infantry units rolled through cities and towns in a coordinated thrust, supported by field police and military administrators prepared to take over civil governance. The initial deployments focused on strategic hubs. Lyon, Clermont-Ferrand, Avignon, and Marseille were among the key urban centers seized within the first 24 hours. Roadblocks were established on main transport arteries, and German liaison officers were dispatched to local French prefectures to deliver formal notices of occupation and demand cooperation. At the same time, Italian forces began advancing from the Alpine frontier, entering southeastern France under Operation Gisela. Their slower progress was attributed to logistical difficulties and mountainous terrain, but they nevertheless secured control over Nice, Toulon's outskirts, and portions of Provence by mid-November. German command in France under General von Rundstedt oversaw the operation with authority delegated to Army Group D. The occupation proceeded with minimal resistance. French military units stationed in the Free Zone, acting under direct orders from Marshal Pétain, avoided confrontation. The armistice clause prohibiting French rearmament meant that few units had the capacity to mount meaningful defense in any case. Where minor incidents of resistance occurred, such as at garrison barracks or police stations, German troops quickly disarmed the personnel and took control without prolonged engagement. The psychological impact of the operation on the Vichy leadership was immediate and profound. Pétain, who had assumed that his cooperation with the Reich would insulate France from further humiliation, now faced the reality of complete occupation. Prime Minister Pierre Laval, who had recently resumed his post after a period of diminished influence, sought to maintain a working relationship with the Germans, framing the occupation as a response to Allied aggression in North Africa rather than a betrayal. He attempted to continue administering civil functions under German oversight, hoping to preserve what remained of Vichy's administrative autonomy. However, the true center of gravity in Vichy France shifted decisively toward German military authorities. German liaison offices were established in all major cities of the former Free Zone, and civilian governance increasingly became a matter of German approval rather than French initiative. French ministries, including the Ministry of the Interior and the Ministry of National Defense, found their powers curtailed. Censorship, already extensive, was reinforced, and German propaganda efforts redoubled their presence in southern France, framing the occupation as a necessary move to secure Europe from Anglo-American subversion. One of the most critical concerns for the Germans during the execution of Case Anton was the fate of the French fleet stationed at Toulon. Comprising battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and submarines, the fleet represented one of the largest naval forces still controlled by Vichy France, and was of strategic interest to both Axis and Allied planners. German intelligence had long feared that the French Navy might defect to the Allies or be seized in the event of an Allied invasion. As German troops advanced toward Toulon, a specialized detachment was assigned to secure the port and its vessels. Despite initial assurances by the Vichy government that the fleet would remain under French control, events unfolded rapidly. On November 27th, after receiving reports of approaching German columns, French naval commanders at Toulon enacted long-prepared scuttling procedures. In a matter of hours, nearly the entire fleet, more than 70 vessels, was sunk by their own crews. Explosives and demolition charges were placed in engine rooms, hulls were flooded, and fuel stores ignited. Smoke billowed over Toulon harbor as battleships capsized and submarines disappeared beneath the water. The Germans arrived too late to prevent the destruction. The scuttling of the fleet, while a blow to German ambitions, also marked the final symbolic act of French military independence. With the fleet destroyed and the southern zone under occupation, there remained no credible force within France capable of resisting German authority. For the Allies, the destruction was a strategic disappointment, removing the possibility of incorporating French ships into their Mediterranean campaign. For the Germans, it was an embarrassment and a failure of rapid coordination. For the Vichy regime, it was the last assertion of national will before its final subordination. The civilian population in the former Free Zone reacted with a mixture of fear, resignation, and growing disillusionment. Initial hopes that the Vichy regime could preserve internal order now gave way to a grim realization. All of France was now occupied, and the limited freedoms once afforded to the southern zone were rapidly disappearing. German patrols began appearing in cities where the war had previously been a distant concern. Rationing intensified. Surveillance increased, informants and German-friendly collaborators extended their reach, and the presence of Italian troops introduced additional layers of occupation bureaucracy. For the resistance, the occupation of the Free Zone opened new possibilities and dangers. Networks that had operated in the shadows of Vichy authority now found themselves confronting direct German control. Recruitment increased as more French citizens, disillusioned by collaborationist policies, joined underground movements. At the same time, repression became more systematic. The Gestapo and Abwehr expanded their activities, and the first coordinated sweeps against resistance cells in the south began in early 1943. Case Anton thus set the conditions for a new, more violent phase of internal conflict within France. The swift execution of Case Anton reaffirmed Germany's dominance over France, but also exposed the limits of Axis cohesion. Italian occupation policies differed in tone and discipline from those of the Germans, leading to friction and administrative confusion. In some areas, local French officials played one side against the other, seeking to preserve influence or delay repressive measures. Moreover, German reliance on the Vichy police to enforce occupation decrees revealed a paradox. The occupiers remained dependent on French institutions even as they dismantled French sovereignty. As German forces completed their deployment across southern France, a new territorial reality had been established. For the first time since June 1940, all of mainland France was under Axis military control. The illusion of Vichy autonomy had ended, and the war within France would now be waged not through diplomacy or armistice clauses, but through occupation, repression, and the escalating struggle between resistance and collaboration. The balance of power had shifted, and with it, the political landscape of France entered its most fraught and consequential phase. The strategic rationale behind Case Anton extended beyond simple territorial acquisition. From the German perspective, the operation was a preemptive security measure designed to prevent France from becoming a platform for Allied offensives. The Axis High Command, still reeling from the surprise and effectiveness of Operation Torch, believed that the Free Zone could no longer be trusted to remain neutral or non-hostile. Intelligence reports suggested increasing clandestine contact between Vichy officials and Allied representatives. The Wehrmacht feared that, left unchecked, French-controlled ports and airfields in the south could be turned over to Allied forces with little notice. Therefore, the primary objective of the occupation was to deny the Allies any strategic foothold in southern France and to complete the military and administrative consolidation of the country. German planners prioritized the seizure of transportation infrastructure, military depots, and communication hubs. Toulon, with its extensive naval facilities, was at the top of the list, not only for its fleet, but also for its dry docks, coastal defenses, and logistical infrastructure. In the background loomed another objective: the integration of the Free Zone's industrial and agricultural output into the German war economy under more direct control. The Italian government, under Benito Mussolini, had long lobbied for a more prominent role in French affairs, particularly in the southeast. Operation Gizella allowed the Italians to extend their influence over areas they had historically claimed, including Nice and parts of Savoy. However, German planners viewed Italian ambitions with suspicion. While the Italians were technically allies, German commanders questioned the operational competence and political reliability of Mussolini's forces. As such, German units were positioned to overshadow or reinforce Italian deployments if needed. Coordination between the two Axis partners was maintained more for appearances than operational necessity. The planning of Case Anton itself was marked by calculated efficiency. Originally drafted in December 1940 as Operation Attila, the occupation plan had undergone revisions to reflect changing circumstances in Europe and within Vichy France. By 1942, with the Eastern Front consuming the bulk of German military resources, any new operation in Western Europe needed to be swift and resource efficient. The operation relied on units already stationed in France, including reserve divisions and administrative battalions, supported by Luftwaffe reconnaissance and liaison teams. Propaganda played an essential role in shaping the German narrative surrounding the occupation. German radio broadcasts and printed media portrayed the operation not as an act of aggression, but as a protective measure in response to Allied treachery in North Africa. The Vichy government was encouraged to adopt this language to preserve a facade of cooperation. German diplomats and liaison officers in Vichy and Paris emphasized that France remained a partner in defending Europe against Anglo-American imperialism and Bolshevism. However, behind closed doors, German authorities made it clear that the days of negotiated autonomy were over. The French administration, under the leadership of Laval, attempted to adapt. Laval had returned to power in April 1942 with the explicit intention of deepening collaboration with Germany, believing that this path offered the best chance of preserving French institutions. In the immediate aftermath of Case Anton, Laval attempted to reassure the French public that the occupation would be orderly and limited in scope. He met with German officials to discuss the continuity of governance and sought to maintain civilian control over policing and internal security. Nevertheless, German authorities were not inclined to compromise. Key ministries were placed under German oversight, and the scope of Laval's authority was increasingly symbolic. The French military apparatus, already diminished by the armistice terms of 1940, was now entirely neutralized. Units that had existed primarily in a ceremonial or administrative capacity were disbanded. Weapons were confiscated, barracks seized, and officers placed under surveillance. The German command feared any residual capacity for organized resistance and acted quickly to dismantle the remaining structures of the armistice army. French officers who had harbored hopes of rebuilding national defense were sidelined or arrested. Some began to seek contact with the internal resistance or flee to Allied territories. In addition to its military objectives, Case Anton was also driven by economic motivations. Germany's occupation of northern France had already granted it control over critical industrial regions, including the coal and steel-producing areas of the north and east. The Free Zone, while less industrialized, still held valuable agricultural capacity and access to Mediterranean trade routes. With full occupation, German requisitioning expanded southward. Farms were assessed for surplus produce, warehouses inventoried, and railways redirected to prioritize German logistical needs. These requisitions deepened shortages for the civilian population and increased resentment toward both the occupiers and the Vichy regime, seen as complicit in their enforcement. Case Anton also reshaped the administrative geography of France. The former demarcation line was effectively erased. New command structures were implemented to administer the entire country as a single occupied zone, albeit with varying degrees of German and Italian presence. In practice, the Germans controlled the entire country through overlapping military, police, and economic authorities. The Italian presence remained secondary, confined mostly to areas of symbolic importance and cultural affinity. This new territorial configuration allowed Germany to more efficiently manage French resources while maintaining strict control over movement, trade, and political activity. Meanwhile, the decision-making structure in Berlin underwent its own shifts. Hitler, increasingly preoccupied with the Eastern Front and obsessed with maintaining order in occupied territories, delegated authority in France to senior military officials and the SS. Heinrich Himmler's security services, already active in the occupied zone, expanded operations into the south. The Gestapo and SD began building networks of informants and collaborators, often drawing on pre-existing contacts within the Vichy administration. The interior surveillance apparatus was strengthened, and new guidelines for repression and political control were drafted for immediate implementation. Despite the apparent success of the operation, there were growing concerns within the German leadership. Case Anton had been completed swiftly and without combat, but it had exposed the fragility of Axis alliances and the limits of Vichy compliance. It had also increased the burden of occupation. Germany now had to administer and police the entirety of France, stretching already thin resources. And although no open rebellion followed the occupation, intelligence analysts noted a sharp increase in subversive activity, underground publications, and acts of sabotage in the weeks that followed. What had been a divided occupation now became a singular, volatile front. For the population of southern France, the transformation was immediate. German military vehicles filled the streets of cities that had previously known only Vichy rule. The presence of armed patrols, roadblocks, and foreign troops signaled a new chapter. Public sentiment, once cautiously tolerant of Vichy's promises of stability, began to shift. The perception that collaboration had failed to protect the nation sparked quiet dissent, and in time, open defiance. The occupation had succeeded militarily, but its political and social consequences were only beginning to unfold. The physical takeover of southern France in November 1942 was accomplished swiftly, but its political, social, and administrative ramifications unfolded more gradually. With Case Anton complete, the Free Zone ceased to exist as a distinct territorial entity. Germany now controlled the entirety of metropolitan France, and with that control came a new intensity in the confrontation between occupation forces, local collaborators, and the growing French resistance. Though there were no large-scale battles during the initial days of the occupation, the seizure of key infrastructure, the reaction of the French fleet at Toulon, and the sudden changes in daily life amounted to a profound national rupture. Among the most consequential early confrontations in the wake of Case Anton was the standoff at Toulon. The German High Command, despite the speed of its ground advances, had underestimated the resolve and preparedness of the French Navy. Throughout 1941 and 1942, French naval commanders had anticipated the possibility that German troops would one day attempt to seize the fleet. Though Vichy authorities maintained official neutrality, naval officers secretly drew up contingency plans for mass scuttling to prevent warships from falling into enemy hands. The plan, developed and rehearsed in segments, included self-destruction procedures that could be initiated within hours. On November 27th, as German forces approached Toulon's outer defenses, Admiral Jean de Laborde, commander of the High Seas Fleet, issued the final order. In a meticulously orchestrated operation, French sailors and engineers destroyed more than 70 warships anchored in the harbor. Explosives were detonated in magazines, seacocks were opened to flood holes, and engine rooms were sabotaged. By the time German troops entered the naval base, they were met with plumes of smoke, fire, and twisted steel. Battleships lay capsized, cruisers were aflame, and dry docks were wrecked beyond repair. The scuttling of the Toulon fleet eliminated any hope Germany had of incorporating French naval assets into the Kriegsmarine and dealt a symbolic blow to German ambitions in the Western Mediterranean. The destruction of the fleet also underscored the limits of German control. While the occupation had neutralized Vichy authority, it had not yet secured the allegiance of key military structures. The fleet's self-destruction demonstrated that, beneath the surface of collaboration, French officers remained committed to denying strategic assets to the Axis. Though the act was not openly pro-Allied, it was certainly anti-German, and its ripple effects spread quickly across France and abroad. In Britain, the scuttling was seen as an act of redemption after the 1940 attack on Mers el-Kébir, in which British forces had sunk part of the French fleet to prevent its use by Germany. Meanwhile, the occupation of major cities in the south introduced new dynamics between German forces and French civilians. Cities such as Marseille, Montpellier, and Toulouse had previously experienced relative calm under Vichy rule. Now, they were subject to the same patterns of repression and exploitation already familiar in the occupied zone. German military governors imposed strict curfews, commandeered government buildings, and began the immediate expansion of security operations. Civilians were required to carry identification papers at all times. Checkpoints and random inspections became routine. Public expressions of dissent, however mild, were punished with increasing severity. The local French police, operating under Vichy structures, were now effectively subordinate to the Gestapo and the Sicherheitsdienst, SD. These German security services began building dossiers on suspected resistors, Jews, communists, and former members of the French military. Surveillance operations were intensified, and the southern zone saw its first mass arrests of Jews in early 1943. The Germans were no longer reliant on indirect control. They now exercised it directly, with French collaborationist institutions acting as enforcement arms. This shift made the repression of dissent more systematic and allowed for a more aggressive anti-resistance strategy. Economic exploitation of the southern territories also accelerated. The German war economy, already strained by operations in the Soviet Union, sought to extract maximum value from occupied France. Southern France's industries, though less developed than the industrial north, were reorganized to support Axis logistics. Agricultural production was requisitioned at higher rates. Transportation infrastructure was diverted to German use, and labor conscription expanded under the Service du Travail Obligatoire, STO, which required young Frenchmen to work in German factories. These policies were deeply unpopular and served as a recruitment tool for the resistant. The psychological impact of the occupation reverberated through all levels of society. For many civilians, especially in the South, the arrival of German troops shattered any remaining illusions that Pétain's policy of collaboration could protect France from deeper subjugation. While some continued to support the Vichy government out of pragmatism or fear of chaos, others began seeking out contact with resistance networks. Intellectuals, students, veterans, and even conservative rural populations, once hesitant to oppose the regime, now saw the German occupation as a turning point that demanded action. In response to this undercurrent, German and Vichy propaganda intensified. Radio broadcasts urged national unity against the threat of Anglo-American imperialism and Jewish Bolshevik sabotage. Posters depicted the Allies as invaders seeking to destroy French civilization. The Vichy government continued to emphasize Marshal Pétain's image as the paternal guardian of France, even as his ability to influence policy diminished. The regime's messages became increasingly hollow, contradicted daily by the presence of foreign troops and by the growing repression on the streets. The resistance movement, while still fragmented and vulnerable, began to mature rapidly in the post-Anton environment. Communications with London and Algiers were expanded through clandestine radio transmissions. New cells formed in towns and rural areas previously untouched by German patrols. Small acts of defiance, graffiti, leaflet distribution, sabotage spread across the South. Resistance leaders such as Jean Moulin worked to unify disparate factions under the Conseil National de la Résistance, CNR, laying the groundwork for a more coordinated national effort. In addition to civilian resistance, the underground press gained strength. Newspapers such as Combat, Libération, and Franc-Tireur expanded their readerships, providing uncensored news, analysis, and calls to action. These publications helped counteract official propaganda and sustained morale in the face of increasing hardship. The occupation had radicalized a population that had once hoped for stability, and with each new repression, the lines between passive endurance and active resistance blurred further. Case Anton had been executed with military efficiency, but its social and political aftermath was far from under control. While the Wehrmacht had completed its sweep of southern France with minimal combat, it now found itself presiding over a volatile and resentful population. The Vichy regime, now stripped of territory and legitimacy, existed only as an administrative shell. And within that shell, opposition was growing, in whispers, in pamphlets, and in silent refusals to comply. The occupation had brought unity of control, but at the cost of igniting a unity of resistance. By the beginning of 1943, the occupation of all of metropolitan France had become a logistical, political, and military reality. The swift execution of Case Anton had achieved its immediate goals, preventing the French fleet from falling into Allied hands, eliminating the Free Zone as a potential Allied beachhead, and dismantling the last facade of Vichy sovereignty. Yet these gains came with complex and intensifying consequences. The newly expanded occupation zone introduced fresh challenges for German administration and required a significant escalation of coercive measures to maintain control. The fragile framework of collaboration had become overstretched, and cracks in the system began to widen under the pressure of resistance, economic strain, and shifting military tides. The German military presence in southern France was consolidated through the expansion of administrative sectors overseen by the Wehrmacht and SS units. Every major city came under a military commandant's jurisdiction, supported by detachments of Feldgendarmerie and the Gestapo. The German command faced an immediate dilemma: how to maintain tight control over a vast area with a finite number of occupation troops, many of whom were older reservists or security personnel withdrawn from other fronts. In response, German authorities leaned heavily on French police and local militias to extend their reach. This arrangement deepened the dependence on the Vichy regime's administrative skeleton, even as it rendered Vichy increasingly irrelevant. Marshal Pétain remained the nominal head of state, and Pierre Laval continued as prime minister, but real power was now exercised through German diktats. Laval sought to prove his utility by intensifying collaboration. His government expanded the enforcement of anti-Jewish laws, accelerated the deportation of Jews to German-controlled territories, and implemented the Service du Travail Obligatoire, STO, in full. The STO became a defining feature of the occupation's second phase, requiring young Frenchmen to register for forced labor in Germany. Resistance to the STO was immediate and widespread. Many evaded registration and sought refuge in rural areas or in the burgeoning resistance networks, particularly in the mountainous Massif Central and Alpine regions. The effect of this policy was twofold. First, it sparked a dramatic increase in resistance recruitment. Young men who might otherwise have remained passive or ambivalent were now faced with a stark choice: submit to deportation or flee to the Maquis, the rural guerrilla groups that formed the backbone of armed opposition in the unoccupied countryside. Second, it placed a new burden on the collaborationist apparatus. To fulfill labor quotas, French police and local authorities were forced to conduct roundups, often violently, which further alienated the population and discredited Vichy as a protector of French interests. The resistance movement itself, while still fragmented by ideology, began to show signs of tactical and organizational maturation. Coordination between urban networks and rural Maquis units improved. Intelligence flowed more efficiently between local cells and Allied contacts in London and Algiers. The British Special Operations Executive, SOE, and the American Office of Strategic Services, OSS, expanded their infiltration of southern France, supplying arms, radios, and advisors via parachute drops. These missions were often facilitated by local contacts who risked arrest and execution to ensure the safe arrival and concealment of Allied operatives. German countermeasures became more systematic in response. In addition to the Gestapo, specialized anti-resistance units such as the Abwehr and Sicherheitspolizei intensified their presence in southern cities. These units employed torture, informants, and mass arrests in an effort to dismantle resistance networks. In cities like Lyon, Toulouse, and Nice, suspected resistance members were executed or deported to concentration camps. The most infamous of these efforts was led by Klaus Barbie, the Gestapo chief in Lyon, whose brutal campaign of repression left a lasting scar on the city's wartime memory. The occupation also escalated anti-Semitic persecution. In the free zone before Case Anton, Jews had experienced discrimination and exclusion under Vichy legislation, but were largely spared mass deportation. That changed after November 1942. With full German control in place, Jewish populations in the South were subjected to the same deportation machinery that had already begun in the North. Internment camps such as Gurs, Rivesaltes, and Les Milles became way stations for Jews awaiting deportation to Auschwitz and other extermination camps. French police played an active role in these operations, further entrenching the regime's complicity in the final solution. Public morale continued to decline. Food shortages worsened as requisitioning increased, black markets flourished, and the urban population faced mounting hardship. Inflation eroded purchasing power, and ration cards became harder to redeem for meaningful quantities of food or supplies. Public transportation was restricted, fuel was scarce, and curfews were strictly enforced. For many in the South, the everyday routines of life collapsed into a new reality defined by scarcity, fear, and surveillance. Despite this, cultural and intellectual resistance began to flourish in parallel. Underground publications circulated widely, often printed using rudimentary presses in basements and barns. Writers, teachers, and students contributed to an expanding discourse of resistance, producing manifestos, poetry, and political commentary that defied censorship. The intellectual resistance helped bind together disparate political factions, from communists to Gaullists to Republicans, around a shared goal: the rejection of collaboration and the restoration of national sovereignty. The Catholic Church in France, which had initially shown caution, began to speak out more forcefully against specific abuses, particularly the treatment of Jews and forced labor conscripts. While some bishops remained aligned with Vichy policies, others used sermons and pastoral letters to offer moral support to the population and, in some cases, shelter to fugitives. Religious institutions became key nodes in humanitarian networks, providing forged documents, food, and safe passage. As 1943 progressed, signs of erosion in German authority became visible. Sabotage of rail lines, attacks on military convoys, and assassinations of German officers became more frequent. The Maquis expanded in both number and confidence. Although still outgunned and often lacking training, they disrupted communications and forced German units to divert forces from the front lines to internal security. These acts of resistance were sometimes followed by brutal reprisals, including the burning of villages and execution of hostages, but the overall momentum shifted toward greater opposition. By the end of 1943, the occupation of southern France had entered a phase of increasing instability. The initial goals of Case Anton, preventing Allied landings, suppressing Vichy defection, and seizing strategic assets, had been realized in the short term. But the long-term consequence was a radicalization of the population, the militarization of resistance, and a rising tide of sabotage that would soon be amplified by Allied preparations for the liberation of Europe. The once quiet provinces of southern France had become a battleground in the shadows, its outcome uncertain, but its cost increasingly apparent. By early 1944, the occupation of southern France, born from the swift and calculated execution of Case Anton, had transformed into a burden of attrition for the German command. What had initially been a strategic maneuver to secure the Mediterranean flank and suppress potential Vichy defection had become a prolonged campaign of repression, control, and reactive violence. Southern France, once spared the immediate cruelties of occupation, was now fully integrated into the machinery of exploitation and fear. Yet within this zone of intensified surveillance and coercion, the resistance movement grew bolder and the Axis grasp began to loosen. The German military and SS apparatus continued to dominate the major cities, ports, and rail networks across the south. Security zones were drawn up with concentric layers of checkpoints, patrol routes, and surveillance nodes. Garrisons operated out of fortified buildings, and military tribunals administered swift justice for suspected resistance activities. Yet, the overstretch of German resources was increasingly visible, with the Wehrmacht committed to major fronts in the Soviet Union and Italy, and anticipating a future Allied landing in Western Europe. The occupation forces in France were insufficient to fully control the territory they claimed to dominate. The Vichy government, which had already been reduced to a tool of German administration, found itself losing influence even within its own bureaucratic apparatus. Laval remained the face of the collaborationist state, but his power was symbolic at best. Real authority rested with German officials such as SS Brigade Führer Karl Oberg, the higher SS and police leader in France, and military governors whose primary concern was order and security. Vichy's ministries were pressured to accelerate the roundup of Jews, intensify labor deportations, and deliver propaganda denouncing the resistance and the Allies. Compliance was met with temporary toleration. Dissent or failure meant removal or arrest. At the local level, the implementation of German directives became increasingly inconsistent. Some French prefects and administrators, sympathetic to the population or fearful of resistance retaliation, stalled or diluted orders. Others, more ideologically aligned with collaborationist doctrines or seeking favor, enforced policies with zeal. This divergence created zones of varying repression. In one town, a resistance member might find shelter among passive officials. In another, they might face immediate arrest and deportation. The unevenness of control became a defining feature of the occupation's later phase. The impact on civilians grew more severe. By 1944, rationing had reached its peak inefficiency. Black markets became essential for survival, especially in urban centers. Coal shortages disrupted heating in winter, and public transportation had virtually collapsed. Schools struggled to function as students were pulled into forced labor or resistance activity. Bombing raids by Allied aircraft, targeting rail junctions and supply depots, added to the strain, often causing civilian casualties and property destruction. Public frustration turned inward, but also began to redirect toward collaborationist institutions, which were increasingly viewed as traitors rather than protectors. The resistance, by contrast, was entering a phase of operational expansion. With the formation of the French Forces of the Interior, FFI, disparate resistance groups, Gaullist, Communist, and Independent, were brought under a loose but increasingly effective command structure. In southern France, the Maquisards, rural guerrilla fighters, became more organized and assertive. They formed regional committees, developed supply lines, and carried out coordinated sabotage operations with growing frequency. The mountainous terrain of the Massif Central, the Cevennes, and the Alps provided natural strongholds from which attacks on Axis targets could be launched with minimal risk of detection. Sabotage operations intensified throughout the spring of 1944. Resistance fighters destroyed bridges, derailed trains carrying German troops or equipment, cut telegraph lines, and ambushed convoys. These attacks disrupted German supply chains and forced the occupiers to divert troops and material to rear area security, weakening their ability to respond to events elsewhere. In some regions, entire road networks became unsafe for German use without armed escort. Every blown track, every burnt-out vehicle served as both strategic interference and a morale blow to the occupiers. In response, the Germans launched a new wave of counterinsurgency operations. One of the most notorious was Operation Frühling, carried out in early 1944 in the Tarn region. SS units and security forces swept through suspected resistance strongholds, arresting civilians, destroying villages, and executing captured fighters. These actions mirrored the tactics used in the East, combining military operations with collective punishment. In some towns, reprisals took the form of public hangings, forced evacuations, or the torching of homes. Such brutal responses intended to deter further rebellion, but in practice, they often pushed more people into the resistance. The summer of 1944 also brought intensified Allied support to the resistance networks. Operation Jedburgh teams, consisting of British, American, and Free French operatives, parachuted into the French interior to organize, train, and coordinate resistance fighters. These teams brought radios, demolition materials, and strategic guidance. In tandem, Allied aircraft increased airdrops of weapons and supplies, including automatic rifles, explosives, and medical kits. The coordination between resistance groups and Allied planners was now directly linked to the larger objective of preparing for the impending Allied invasion of France. The resistance's role was no longer merely symbolic or disruptive. It was now part of the strategic architecture of liberation. In preparation for D-Day, the Allies counted on the resistance to tie down German forces, delay reinforcements, and destroy infrastructure critical to German mobility. In the south, this meant sabotaging rail lines connecting Toulouse, Marseille, and Lyon to the northern front, and ambushing convoys that might move troops to Normandy. Maquis groups expanded their operations, sometimes numbering in the hundreds and mounting near-conventional attacks on German outposts. In some areas, provisional zones of liberation emerged, where German or Vichy authority had effectively collapsed. Local resistance leaders assumed administrative functions, restoring order, issuing identity papers, and coordinating with nearby cells. Though temporary and often precarious, these zones symbolized the coming reversal of power. They also prompted sharper reprisals. German authorities, aware of the growing loss of control, increased surveillance and punitive measures. Hostage-taking, already practiced earlier in the occupation, became systematic, with reprisals issued for every German casualty reported in resistance areas. Amid this escalating conflict, the civilian population became both a source of support and a target. Resistance fighters relied heavily on local shelter, food, and information. Civilians provided crucial assistance, often at great risk. In turn, they bore the brunt of reprisals when resistance activity was discovered. The line between combatant and non-combatant blurred. Entire communities became implicated, by choice, by association, or by accusation. By the middle of 1944, the dynamic of occupation in southern France had changed irreversibly. The territory seized under Case Anton was no longer passive or stable. It was contested ground. German control persisted in urban centers and key transport hubs, but rural France, particularly its southern interior, was becoming a battlefield. What had begun as a preventive occupation was now a slow-motion insurgency, with Axis forces facing growing internal revolt just as the external Allied assault on France was about to begin. The clock was ticking toward liberation, but the cost, already steep, would continue to climb. By July 1944, the occupation forces in southern France were facing a critical escalation. What had been, for nearly 2 years, a low-grade campaign of counterinsurgency was now rapidly transforming into an open confrontation between German garrisons and increasingly emboldened resistance formations. Allied support, air power, and internal coordination had allowed the Maquis and urban networks to evolve from scattered cells into structured regional forces capable of staging operations on a significant scale. With the Normandy landings in full effect since June, and signs of an impending second front in the south, the occupation entered its final and most volatile phase. The French resistance, now consolidated under the banner of the Forces Françaises de l'Intérieur, FFI, undertook coordinated attacks on Axis infrastructure throughout southern France. Sabotage became methodical and strategically focused. Rail lines from Toulouse to Lyon were severed. Ammunition trains were destroyed near Avignon, and telecommunications between German military headquarters in Marseille and field units in the interior were repeatedly cut. These attacks, supported by intelligence from Allied agents, were no longer isolated disruptions. They were integrated into the broader Allied operational timetable. In regions such as the Vercors Plateau, Haute-Loire, and Tarn, entire pockets of territory were temporarily freed from German control. Resistance fighters in the Vercors declared a provisional Free Republic, establishing administrative control, airstrips for Allied supply drops, and a symbolic declaration of opposition to the Vichy regime and German occupation. Though tactically vulnerable and logistically overextended, these liberated zones represented a psychological and political turning point. They demonstrated that the resistance was no longer just reactive. It was asserting territorial authority and openly challenging Axis dominance. German forces responded with brutal and systematic repression. The Sicherheitsdienst, SD, Gestapo, and SS units launched anti-partisan operations across key regions, often combining intelligence with scorched earth tactics. One of the most infamous was the July 1944 assault on the Vercors. In a combined operation involving paratroopers, mountain troops, and air support, German forces overwhelmed the resistance stronghold. Villages were bombed from the air, medical centers were destroyed, and captured fighters were summarily executed. Inhabitants accused of aiding the resistance were deported or shot, and entire communities were erased in acts of collective punishment. These reprisals, however, had diminishing deterrent effect. Rather than extinguishing resistance, they confirmed the perception, widely held among the French population, that German authority was reliant on terror and increasingly desperate. Acts of reprisal no longer instilled fear, as they had in 1942 or 1943. Instead, they hardened public resolve and drew thousands more into the ranks of the resistance, particularly young men seeking to avoid the STO and civilians seeking to avenge local atrocities. The Italian surrender in September 1943 had already shifted some dynamics in the region, but its full effects were now being felt. Former Italian-occupied areas in southeastern France came under direct German control, and German troops moved to disarm Italian units that had not yet withdrawn. This transition was not always smooth. In some towns, Italian soldiers resisted, surrendered to resistance forces, or simply fled. The vacuum created by their departure was rapidly filled by resistance cells, especially in coastal and alpine areas where German presence was thinner. Meanwhile, the Vichy regime, clinging to the remnants of authority, was facing terminal decline. Pierre Laval continued to issue statements condemning the resistance and encouraging labor conscription, but few listened. His government's orders were increasingly ignored by local officials, and Vichy's administrative capacity in the south collapsed in many areas. In Marseille, Toulouse, and Grenoble, German command bypassed Vichy institutions entirely, relying on military police and SS detachments to enforce security. Even the collaborationist milice, the paramilitary force created by the Vichy government to combat the resistance, was failing to maintain order. Though initially feared for its ruthlessness, by mid-1944, the milice had become a symbol of desperation. Heavily armed but often poorly trained, its members were spread thin and demoralized. Assassinations of milice officers became common in urban areas, while rural patrols were increasingly ambushed. The population's hostility toward the milice further isolated Vichy and eroded any claims of legitimacy it had left. In the build-up to Operation Dragoon, the Allied landing in southern France, scheduled for August 1944, resistance activity reached a peak. Allied command, working through British and American intelligence networks, instructed FFI units to intensify sabotage in the days preceding the invasion. This coordination included the destruction of bridges, cutting of railways, and ambushes of German convoys. In some areas, resistance groups managed to temporarily sever German communications with Italy and northern France, delaying reinforcements and isolating coastal garrisons. At the same time, German military planners were increasingly aware of the vulnerability of their southern positions. The Wehrmacht had already begun withdrawing some frontline units northward in response to the Allied advance from Normandy, weakening coastal defenses along the Riviera. Strategic Command anticipated an invasion, but could not predict the exact landing points. German divisions in the south were understrength and overstretched, with many garrisons composed of older soldiers, foreign conscripts, and rear-echelon troops ill-prepared for sustained combat. Despite these disadvantages, German commanders continued to enforce harsh occupation policies. In the final weeks before Dragoon, mass arrests and executions increased. Towns suspected of harboring resistance cells were placed under siege or blockaded. Civilians were used as human shields during troop movements, and deportations of Jews and political prisoners accelerated in a last effort to fulfill quotas before liberation. These actions, while severe, further inflamed the population and ensured that, when Allied forces landed, they would be welcomed not just as liberators, but as avengers. By early August, southern France stood on the edge of liberation. The German occupation, imposed through Case Anton and sustained for 21 months, had exhausted its political capital, overextended its military assets, and radicalized the population it sought to subdue. Roads were mined, bridges were down, and garrisons were under siege. The resistance had evolved from scattered bands into a coordinated auxiliary army. The balance of power had shifted irreversibly. The occupiers could still inflict violence, but they could no longer command obedience. The reckoning was imminent. On August 15, 1944, Operation Dragoon commenced. Allied forces, composed primarily of American and Free French divisions, landed along the southern coast of France between Toulon and Caen. Supported by naval bombardments and airborne drops inland, the invasion force rapidly broke through thin German coastal defenses. Within hours, beachheads were secured, and Allied mechanized units began pushing northward into the interior. The occupation regime that had been imposed under Case Anton now began to collapse in real time, overtaken by military advances it could no longer resist, and internal revolts it could no longer contain. German defensive plans for southern France had always been secondary to the main efforts in the north. Following the landings in Normandy in June, much of the German strategic focus had shifted to resisting Allied momentum there. Southern garrisons were understaffed, under-resourced, and disconnected from high command. Many units consisted of second-line troops, foreign auxiliaries, and occupation forces not trained or equipped for high-intensity combat. The 7th Army, tasked with defending southern France, lacked the strength to repel the landing, and instead began planning a tactical withdrawal toward the Rhone Valley and then into eastern France and Germany. The speed of the Allied advance was remarkable. Within days, Saint-Tropez, Fréjus, and Hyères were liberated. Resistance units, already in place and awaiting activation orders, launched coordinated attacks on rail junctions, German columns, and administrative outposts to assist the invasion. In Marseille and Toulon, uprisings broke out before Allied troops even reached the cities. Resistance fighters engaged German garrisons directly, seizing police stations, cutting power lines, and blocking roads. In some areas, they fought house to house, relying on small arms and improvised explosives. Civilians provided food, medical care, and intelligence. In these moments, the resistance was not an auxiliary force. It was the vanguard of liberation. Toulon, heavily defended and essential to the German naval command, witnessed some of the fiercest urban fighting in the campaign. French troops of the First Army under Général de Lattre de Tassigny laid siege to the port, supported by naval fire and air strikes. The city fell after a week of combat. German defenders, many of them naval personnel and remnants of Wehrmacht security units, fought tenaciously but were ultimately overrun or captured. Shortly afterward, Marseille, France's second-largest city, also fell. Resistance forces inside the city coordinated with advancing French troops to eliminate remaining German strongpoints and prevent the destruction of port infrastructure. Despite German demolition attempts, the port was quickly made operational again, providing the Allies with a crucial logistical asset. The German retreat from southern France became a chaotic and dangerous affair. Retreating columns were harassed by resistance units at every turn. In the narrow passes of the Massif Central, ambushes turned highways into killing zones. Railway sabotage delayed troop movements, and fuel shortages left convoys stranded and vulnerable. Entire units surrendered rather than face destruction in unfamiliar terrain. What had been orderly lines of withdrawal turned into fragmented and panicked movements northward. Command cohesion collapsed as units lost contact with headquarters, and desertion among non-German auxiliaries spiked. As the Wehrmacht pulled out, the occupation infrastructure disintegrated. German administrative offices were abandoned, records burned, and collaborators left behind. Militia units, already demoralized, attempted to flee or negotiate surrender. In some towns, captured militians were executed by resistance tribunals or lynched by civilians. Vichy officials, realizing that their protection was evaporating, either fled to Germany or went into hiding. Laval and Pétain were evacuated by German forces and taken to Sigmaringen in Germany, where they would become the figureheads of an exiled, powerless Vichy government in exile. Liberation brought with it a wave of purges and reckonings. The épuration légale, legal purge, and the épuration sauvage, wild purge, swept through the newly freed territories. Collaborators, real and suspected, were arrested, interrogated, and in many cases executed without trial. Women accused of consorting with German soldiers were publicly humiliated, often having their heads shaved in town squares. Former informants, Vichy officials, and members of the milice were targeted in spontaneous acts of retribution. In areas where atrocities had occurred under German command, entire communities took part in vengeance actions. The rule of law, still re-establishing itself, often lagged behind the need for justice, and the line between retribution and excess was frequently crossed. The resistance, now emerging from the underground, faced the challenge of transition. Many fighters had no official military status, no formal leadership, and no defined political alignment beyond opposition to German occupation and Vichy rule. As Free French authorities under de Gaulle began asserting control over liberated territories, efforts were made to integrate resistance units into the new French army. This process was often uneven, complicated by ideological differences, personal rivalries, and conflicting loyalties. Nonetheless, it marked the transformation of the resistance from a fragmented clandestine force into a recognized component of France's national recovery. German casualties during the retreat were high. In addition to losses in combat and ambushes, thousands of troops were captured during encirclements or while attempting to blend into civilian populations. Those who escaped north faced further obstacles as railways remained severed and fuel was in critically short supply. German high command, increasingly isolated from events on the ground, issued contradictory orders that only deepened the chaos. By the end of August, the 7th Army had been pushed out of most of southern France, leaving behind thousands of prisoners, destroyed equipment, and collapsed lines of communication. The fall of southern France dealt a devastating blow to the German strategic position in Western Europe. It deprived the Wehrmacht of critical port facilities, severed key supply routes, and exposed the southern flank of the German defenses. It also marked the death knell for any remaining illusions about Vichy's relevance or the stability of German rear areas. Hitler's bet on maintaining passive control through occupation and collaboration had failed. Case Anton had been tactically sound in 1942, but by 1944, the very territory it had sought to secure had become indefensible. For the people of southern France, liberation was both a triumph and a reckoning. The long ordeal of occupation, marked by scarcity, violence, and betrayal, ended not with quiet relief, but with gunfire, celebration, and often bloodshed. Towns welcomed returning tricolor flags with parades, but also witnessed the darker rituals of revenge. Churches tolled bells, but courts filled with trials. Liberation came quickly, but healing would take far longer. The occupation that had begun in calculated silence now ended in the roar of tanks, the crack of resistance rifles, and the collective exhalation of a people who had endured and outlasted their occupiers. In the weeks and months following the liberation of southern France, the remnants of the occupation and the ruptures it had inflicted came fully into view. What had begun as a swift, calculated military maneuver under Case Anton in 1942 had left behind a fractured society, a compromised state, and an exhausted population. The collapse of German authority and the flight of Vichy's highest officials created a political vacuum, and into that space surged both the Free French administration under Charles de Gaulle and the forces of retribution. The military defeat of the occupiers had been achieved, but the moral and institutional reckoning with occupation was only beginning. The most immediate task was the re-establishment of legitimate French governance. In liberated cities such as Marseille, Lyon, and Toulouse, local resistance committees had often already assumed administrative functions even before Allied troops arrived. These committees, composed of former maquisards, political activists, civil servants, and community leaders, had maintained order, restored basic services, and in many cases detained suspected collaborators. Some had even begun conducting summary trials and executions. While their authority was rooted in popular legitimacy, it lacked uniformity, coordination, and legal structure. General de Gaulle, determined to assert centralized control and prevent both Allied occupation and internal fragmentation, moved swiftly. The Provisional Government of the French Republic, GPRF, operating from Paris after its liberation in late August, began deploying commissaires de la République, official representatives tasked with reclaiming state authority, standardizing justice, and integrating resistance efforts into the framework of national governance. In the South, this often involved a delicate balancing act, recognizing the contributions of the resistance while reining in uncontrolled retributions and informal tribunals. The process of epuration or purification became one of the most contentious aspects of post-liberation France. It took two forms. The épuration sauvage, wild purge, had already begun during the liberation, driven by local anger, grief, and a desire for justice. In rural areas, suspected informants, German sympathizers, and members of the milice were summarily executed, often without formal trial. In cities, acts of public humiliation, such as the head shaving of women accused of consorting with Germans, were widespread. The social fabric of many communities was torn apart, as long-standing relationships were shattered by accusations, denunciations, and retribution. The state-sanctioned épuration légale attempted to bring order to this chaos. Special courts known as chambres civiques and cours de justice were established to investigate and prosecute collaborationist crimes. Across southern France, thousands of individuals were arrested and charged with treason, intelligence with the enemy, economic collaboration, or participation in occupation forces. Some trials were swift and symbolic, others dragged on for months, mired in conflicting evidence, local politics, and procedural complexity. While some high-profile figures, such as milice leaders and prominent Vichy officials, received death sentences or long prison terms, many others faced fines, professional disqualification, or short-term imprisonment. The resistance, meanwhile, faced its own transformation. As the Maquis disbanded or were absorbed into the newly reconstituted French army, the challenge became one of memory and legitimacy. Competing resistance groups, communists, Gaullists, socialists, sought to define the narrative of liberation in terms that favored their own role and vision for post-war France. Political rivalries, suppressed during the occupation, now re-emerged. In southern France, where resistance groups had often operated autonomously, tensions between local leaders and national authorities were common. Disputes over recognition, rank, and pensions arose, while debates over who had truly resisted and who had merely adapted became increasingly politicized. Economically, the South faced immense reconstruction challenges. Infrastructure damaged by years of sabotage, bombing, and neglect required urgent repair. Ports such as Marseille and Toulon, while rapidly reopened by Allied engineers, still bore the scars of occupation and liberation battles. Rail networks, essential for resupplying Allied armies pushing north, took priority, leaving rural areas struggling to reconnect with markets and administrative centers. Food shortages persisted into 1945, worsened by disrupted harvests and lingering black market networks that had thrived under occupation. Socially, the divisions carved by the occupation remained raw. Families had been divided by political loyalties. Public opinion was fragmented between those who had actively resisted, those who had accommodated, and those who had profited. In towns across the South, the question of who had collaborated, and to what degree, became a source of lasting tension. Whispered accusations persisted long after formal trials ended. In some cases, resistance leaders who had once been hailed as heroes found themselves accused of summary justice or wartime abuses. The line between vengeance and justice was often blurred. The Jewish population of southern France, particularly those who had survived deportation or gone into hiding, faced a painful return to visibility. Families returned from concentration camps, when they returned at all, to find their homes confiscated, their businesses gone, and their communities decimated. While some local authorities offered restitution, the broader process of legal and financial recovery was slow and often impeded by bureaucratic indifference or lingering anti-Semitism. The role of Vichy and French police in the deportation of Jews became a source of national shame, but one that would not be fully confronted until decades later. Internationally, the liberation of southern France reinforced the legitimacy of the Free French government and de Gaulle's leadership. By retaking control of major ports and re-establishing French governance without Allied occupation, de Gaulle secured a seat at the negotiating tables of post-war Europe. The success of the resistance and the rapid collapse of the occupation also shaped Allied perceptions of French resolve, helping to counter earlier doubts about France's role in the war effort. Southern France, which had once symbolized defeat and submission, now represented resilience and resurgence. Yet beneath the national narrative of unity and renewal, the legacy of Case Anton lingered. The occupation had not been merely military, it had involved the systematic dismantling of sovereignty, the integration of French institutions into the Nazi war machine, and the participation of French authorities in the repression of their own people. The psychological toll of these years left a quiet residue. Distrust of government, re-examination of authority, and a deepened sense of regional identity in parts of the South where resistance had been strongest. By the end of 1944, the map of France had changed again, but the memories of November 1942 remained. What had been justified as a protective measure by German propaganda had, in fact, accelerated the death of Vichy, the radicalization of the resistance, and the final confrontation between occupation and liberation. As France moved toward the closing chapter of the war, the lessons of Case Anton stood clear, that sovereignty lost under pressure could only be reclaimed through sacrifice, unity, and, ultimately, confrontation. The long-term consequences of Case Anton extended far beyond the immediate military objectives it achieved in November 1942. Though executed in a matter of days, the occupation of Vichy France fundamentally altered the trajectory of wartime France and left a legacy that would echo through its post-war politics, memory, and identity. What had begun as a calculated reaction to Allied landings in North Africa became a turning point in the relationship between France and its occupiers, between the Vichy state and its population, and between the resistance and the emerging vision of a post-liberation republic. Strategically, Case Anton had achieved its primary goal. It denied the Allies access to southern France via Vichy territory and preempted any potential alliance between the Vichy administration and the Anglo-American coalition. It also allowed Germany to bring the remainder of France under direct military control, simplifying administration and suppressing potential military threats from within the Free Zone. But these short-term gains masked deeper failures. The occupation vastly increased the logistical and manpower burdens on the German military and security apparatus, tying down thousands of troops in rear area duties and counterinsurgency operations, at a moment when every battalion was needed on the Eastern Front and in Italy. Politically, the operation destroyed the last vestiges of Vichy's claim to sovereignty. Though Pétain and Laval remained figureheads for a collaborationist regime, Their influence ended the moment German troops crossed the demarcation line. From November 1942 onward, the Vichy government existed only at the pleasure of Berlin, its policies dictated by German needs, its institutions hollowed out by occupation, and its reputation irreparably stained by its complicity in the deportation of Jews, forced labor, and suppression of the resistance. The psychological effect on the French public was equally profound. For many in the southern regions who had previously experienced a more ambiguous, though no less authoritarian form of occupation, the arrival of German troops marked a shattering of illusions. Case Anton revealed that no amount of compromise or collaboration could protect France from direct domination. The image of Pétain as a paternal shield was irreparably broken, and with it, the trust of many who had hoped for neutrality and national survival through passivity. This shift in sentiment fed directly into the growth of the resistance. The occupation of the Free Zone radicalized a generation, especially the youth, who faced conscription into German industry under the STO, and who now understood that their future could not be negotiated. It had to be fought for. Rural regions that had previously been passive became active recruiting grounds for the Maquis. Urban centers saw an explosion of clandestine press, sabotage networks, and coordination with Allied intelligence. Case Anton, in attempting to suppress potential instability, ignited a far more dangerous insurgency. In the broader historical narrative, Case Anton is often overshadowed by the more dramatic events of D-Day, the liberation of Paris, or the battle for the Atlantic. Yet its significance lies in its quiet, bureaucratic violence, the way it silently erased an entire zone of nominal sovereignty and replaced it with direct control. It was the final stripping away of pretense. After November 1942, there was no ambiguity. All of France was occupied, and all of France was in resistance or in submission. In the post-war period, the legacy of Case Anton became central to debates over memory, collaboration, and national identity. For decades, the official narrative of the French Republic, shaped by de Gaulle and his successors, emphasized a nation united in resistance, momentarily deceived, but ultimately defiant. The role of Vichy and the willing participation of French institutions in German policies, including the Holocaust, was downplayed or ignored. It was not until the latter part of the 20th century that historians and the public began to confront the full implications of Case Anton, that the collaboration was not merely imposed, but enacted with the complicity of French actors who continued to serve under occupation, even after the illusion of autonomy was gone. Cultural memory of Case. Anton is embedded in the broader memory of the occupation. Films, literature, and public commemorations often touch on the themes it symbolized: betrayal, passivity, moral compromise, and awakening. In regions such as the Vercors and the Tarn, where resistance flourished after the occupation extended south, local memorials emphasize the suddenness of German arrival and the resilience that followed. In Toulon and Marseille, the memory of resistance is tied to the city's own uprisings and the role it played in expelling occupation forces. Yet there remains a tension in how the story is told, between heroism and complicity, between liberation and revenge. In military histories, Case Anton is examined as an operation of political necessity rather than strategic innovation. It did not rely on shock and awe or massive force concentration. It succeeded because it faced no organized resistance, and yet its consequences were disproportionately large. By occupying the entire French mainland, Germany sowed the seeds of its eventual defeat there, spreading its forces too thin, provoking an irrepressible insurgency, and discrediting the one collaborator regime that had helped manage French society without constant force. Ultimately, Case Anton serves as a historical hinge, a moment when the war in France moved from ambiguity to clarity. It represents the final unraveling of the Vichy experiment and the beginning of the resistance's ascendancy. It reminds us that occupation is not merely about territorial control. It is about legitimacy, consent, and the narratives a population tells itself in the face of foreign power. The German seizure of southern France was swift and bloodless in execution, but its legacy was long, bloody, and deeply rooted in the conscience of a nation still grappling with the choices it made under pressure. In the closing months of the war, as French forces joined their allies in pushing into Germany, the memory of that November in 1942 lingered, not as a story of conquest, but as a moment of profound rupture. From it came reckoning, resistance, and the long road to the reconstitution of the French Republic.